but I don't really use slides for shorter talks anyway. All I had was one page with my name on it. So it's not a great loss. So I see we're starting about 10 minutes late. I'll try to finish my talk in about 15 or so minutes and try and leave some time for questions. My name is Badri Natarajan. I'm a lawyer from London. I'm based in London. I do a lot of work with crypto companies and blockchain projects and so on. And what I'm going to talk about today is some of the lessons and advice that I give to a lot of my clients, and talk about the lessons that blockchain projects can learn and think in terms of legal risk. This is based both on my work with my clients and on what I see in the broader space. Now, my background is very much a traditional finance lawyer, finance litigation lawyer. I used to work at a big law firm called Clifford Chance in London for many years. And before that, I did a lot of work in technology law. I worked at this place called the Electronic Frontier Foundation in the US, which does a lot of work on internet law. So I've seen this from both sides. And in the last couple of years, I've started doing a lot of work with blockchain projects. In this talk, I'm going to divide it into three parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk about some overarching principles that I think it's useful for people working on blockchain projects to keep in mind. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of legal risks that blockchain projects face. And finally, I'm going to talk about strategies to mitigate those risks and practical ways in which to think about that risk, which are the 7 deadly sins, which are the things not to do. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the technical legal issues. They vary a lot between countries, and I don't have time anyway, but the basic principles apply in any country. So the first thing I want to talk about, especially for people here who have an engineering background or who are developers, is that the law and developing engineering are really not that different. Law is basically code that controls the behavior of human beings. It's not some kind of alien, foreign thing that is difficult to understand or difficult to follow. The way I look at a legal contract is pretty much, and review a legal contract, is very similar to the way someone does a security audit of a smart contract. And it's almost exactly the same thing. The main point I want to emphasize here is that the principle of technical debt applies to legal contracts and legal relations just as much as it does to software. For people who don't know what technical debt means, it's basically the idea that if you take a small shortcut early on in a project because it saves you a little time or saves you a little bit of hassle, the cost of fixing the problems that arise from it just balloons over time. And after 5 years, 10 years, there's a huge amount of effort needed to fix the problem, if it's fixable at all. One of the best examples of that is the Y2K bug, which someone made a small decision in the 60s, and we ended up with a multinational problem which took hundreds of thousands of coders to solve. Exactly the same thing applies with legal decisions. The decisions you make in the early days of any project will have a lasting impact which will affect you for a long time. Things like which country you set up operations, what corporate structure you use, who you go into business with, things like that. When I was a little kid, I had this computer called a ZX Spectrum, and I used to code in BASIC on it when I was about 8. And then when I was a teenager, I used to run Linux on the desktop in the 90s. And then for some reason, I just became a lawyer instead of an engineer. And I used to think this was a big shift between being a lawyer and being an engineer, but it actually wasn't. It's pretty much exactly the same way of thinking, only it's applied to people instead of computers. So, part 2. What is legal and regulatory risk? It's a big word. People start thinking and worrying, well, I'll get into legal trouble or something will happen. In the simplest terms, it's getting into trouble with the courts or the legal system in a country. That's all. In terms of the practical consequences, what it means usually is that if you get into legal trouble, you'll have to spend a lot of time and money and hassle dealing with it. That means you might have to pay a fine. In a worst case scenario, there might be criminal consequences or your business may shut down. But what it means is there'll be legal proceedings in a court or with the regulator or the government, and you have to deal with them. Now, regulatory risk is basically a subset of legal risk. It's just getting into trouble with the government or a regulator instead of any other kind of legal risk. I don't really have the time to talk about it today, but of course there can be legal risks other than the ones that you get into with the government. You could have disputes between founders, you could have a former employee who's suing you, all kinds of things are possible. But for now, I'm going to focus mainly on regulatory risk and government risk. Now, of course, any company can get into trouble with the government. It doesn't just have to be a blockchain project or a crypto project. But blockchain projects tend to be unique because legal systems weren't developed with them in mind. So just the existence of a blockchain project can cause legal issues and can cause legal problems. This is what makes most people nervous. In that sense, it's a lot like the internet was in the 1990s, for those who remember it. There was a time when people thought that the law just didn't apply to the internet, which is wrong. And I hear people even now saying the law doesn't apply to the blockchain, which is also wrong. All that happened is that it took time for governments and laws to evolve, which took maybe about 10 years in the case of the internet, from the time it went mainstream in the mid-1990s. It'll probably take a few more years with blockchain, but it will happen. It's already happening, and the process is building up pace, and it's something that needs to be planned for. But the important thing to keep in mind here is that this is where the opportunity also lies. Legal uncertainty means there's opportunities for people who are willing to accept that uncertainty and deal with it. The important thing is you need to make understanding legal risk and having a plan for dealing with the legal risk a core part of your business model. It's not something that you think of as an afterthought. It's something you think of from the beginning. I saw something on Twitter recently. I forget who it was, but it was a venture capitalist on a panel somewhere, and he was quoted as saying something along the lines of, DeFi projects shouldn't worry about legal risks. They should just think about growing users and offering a service people want to use. Don't do this, guys. Really, do not do this. If I had slides, I'd have a picture up of someone sticking their head directly into a hole in the sand, because this is exactly the kind of thing that will come back and bite you. So anyway, moving on, I'm going to look at a few specific examples of the kind of risks that DeFi projects face. This could be a talk by itself, so I'm just going to run through it very quickly. The first one is sometimes there are just legal barriers which make projects impossible. Sometimes the legal barriers are really obvious. So for example, until today, when the Indian Supreme Court struck down the ban, India did not allow its banks to provide any kind of services to companies in the crypto blockchain space. Other problems are a lot more subtle. So for example, it's virtually impossible to have a regulated DEX in Europe because of certain European regulations. Those of you who were at YesX talk yesterday, saw this in a little more detail. But that is something you probably won't find out until you do a little more research and get deeper into it. The point to emphasize here is when you have what's called a pure legal barrier which makes your project impossible, you essentially have three options. Option one, change your product or your business model to be legally compliant. Option 2, move to a jurisdiction where you are legally compliant. Or option 3, what I call the Uber approach, ignore the law, say I'll handle the consequences, and hope that you grow big enough, fast enough, and get rich enough that you can fight back. That's not necessarily a bad idea. I mean, Uber pulled it off, not without consequences, but it just needs a lot of very careful planning and very clear understanding of what the risks are and what you're prepared to do. Next issue. DeFi is a global product. Anyone in the world who has access to the internet can access it, but regulation is local. There are something like 200 countries in the world. I think it's 196 countries. And in theory, a DeFi project will have to comply with all of them. For all practical purposes, this is impossible. The main takeaway here is, one, the most important jurisdiction you have to worry about is your home jurisdiction. You need to be as careful as possible to be compliant with the laws where the project is based. And two, the most common consequence of this is that markets tend to fragment. Most projects make a judgment call on, we will be compliant with this country and maybe a few other countries, but in certain other countries where we're not compliant, either we'll just ignore them and hope they don't come after us, or we'll block access to them. This is why in the previous talk, all the prediction markets mentioned, or most of them, had geographic blocks for different countries depending on where they came down on this spectrum. Now, as a separate issue, it is of course impossible to block access to smart contracts directly on the blockchain. All most projects can do is block geographic access to some countries for their front end. But that's not something we can really get into in this talk, so I'll just move on. There's a couple of other things. There's consumer protection issues. You could get sued because somebody used your service and lost money, or they thought the service wasn't good enough. For example, I've heard a lot of talk on Twitter about people who want to sue Fulcrum for the attacks that happened a couple of weeks ago, and which, it's resulted in about $1 million being lost. But finally, and most importantly, there's a whole category of risks which comes from the tension between centralization and decentralization, and where on that spectrum your project lies. If you take one thing away from this talk, this is the point I want everyone to remember. Decentralization and centralization, it's a spectrum. And you have to make a very conscious choice between the two poles and where you end up on them. They both have advantages. The short version is that the more centralized you are, the easier it is to run your project. The better your project is. You can respond quickly, you can market better, you can make decisions quickly, you can fix problems more quickly. But the more legal risks you also have. The more control you have over a project, the less you can say, I have nothing to do with that, it's just some smart contract on the blockchain. Vitalik had a fantastic blog post about this idea a couple of months ago, and it's something that I try to emphasize to everyone. You make a decision and you take the trade-offs of that decision, and it's worth making that decision in a very conscious way. This is why the current thinking for a lot of projects is that they'll start off centralized, build a community and a user base, and then move to being decentralized. This is great in theory, and there's a very influential A16Z Andreessen Horowitz blog post where they set out a strategy for DeFi projects to do this. It could work, we just don't know yet. But it's worth trying as a strategy. So to give this as an example, something like Uniswap, which is just a smart contract on the blockchain and the founders don't have much control over it and they don't make any money from it, is in a relatively good position legally. It's not a magic bullet. You can have a government who's looking for someone to blame, just try and come after the developer of the smart contract, but it's a pretty good place to start. if people started making, the developers of Uniswap started making money from it, they'd be in a weaker legal position. So moving on from there, part 3. Let's assume you have a DeFi startup and you're thinking about how to mitigate your risks. So these are the 7 things not to do, the 7 sins. The first sin. Oh, and by the way, some of these sound a bit contradictory because they're more like principles which apply in different ways in different contexts. Okay, I've got about 5 minutes. I'll run through it quickly. The first sin. Ignorance is not bliss. You need to be proactive and have a plan. This is the first sin because it is the most important one. There's no excuse for a failure to plan and prepare for contingencies. Now that said, there are no guarantees. You know, as Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the face. But it's still better than nothing. Take Telegram, for example. They actually tried to be as legally compliant as possible when they did their ICO. It didn't prevent them from getting into trouble with the SEC and getting into a big legal battle that's going on now. But it's still better than nothing. They'd have been much worse off if they hadn't done that. Managing legal risk is a core part of the project. Second sin, don't go to the other extreme. You can't ignore your business. That is the most important thing. Unless the legal risk is a bet the company risk, or the legal risk means you might go to jail, in which case, well, that comes first. I think it's Nassim Taleb who said, in order to prosper, you must first survive. The third sin. This is the thing I most often have to explain to my clients, because a lot of people come to me and say, what is the law? And expect that there's this kind of fixed yes or no answer I can give. I mean, how many people here have spoken to lawyers or listened to lawyers and thought, I can't get a straight answer? Yeah, almost everyone. Or anyway. This is the reason. There's a misunderstanding about what the law means. The law is basically an opinion. If you come to me and say, what's the law? I'll tell you, in effect, my opinion is that the law is this. That's true even of the government, and that is true even of regulators. If they come after you, they have an opinion. The only time a law is binding is when a court rules saying this is the law as applicable to you. Not even as applicable to someone else, as applicable to you. To put it in other words, any opinion about the law is an expression of a particular risk tolerance. And you can find justification for that anywhere. So a lot of cases are, so the takeaway from this is, the law is not an absolute. It's a question in a lot of cases about what level of risk you're willing to take. This is of course true in a frontier space like DeFi. If you murder someone, I'm telling you now, it's definitely illegal. But in a space like this, with so many gray areas, a lot of it is just an opinion. So don't take it as this kind of edict handed down from heaven, because it's not. The fourth sin, on the other hand, you shouldn't drift or play it safe, because it's easier to drift along and just keep running your project and not have any idea what's happening on the legal side. Bad idea. The fifth sin, not engaging in forum shopping. What this means is basically that it's worth thinking, if it's feasible for you, about moving to a jurisdiction that's more friendly, because so many of your legal risks and the consequences come from where you're based. It's not possible for everyone, but I know people who've done it, and it's definitely worth thinking about. The sixth sin, forgetting that regulators and the government are people. It's easy to be just really nervous or really scared or really hostile to regulators or the government and think they're trying to stop us innovating, they're trying to stop all of these good things. And that's justified to an extent, but really regulators are just people trying to do their jobs. There's a law, they can't ignore it, we can't ignore it, and they're just trying to enforce it. It won't always work, but in a lot of cases, it's very possible to reach an agreement with them if you can communicate with them and educate them. And it's important not to forget that. And with that, I am done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions? Anything? No. Yeah.
Regarding front-end and geo-blocking, do you recommend projects launch maybe on IPFS so the whole problem goes away?
The problem doesn't go away because, okay, the short answer is the problem won't go away. The government can still come after the person who put it on IPFS, but it's better than nothing. You know, the project will stay up because it's on IPFS. It won't stop the developer from getting into trouble.
But it's probably a good idea to launch an IPFS.
It will make the project more resilient, yes. Let me put it another way. The fact that it's on IPFS doesn't change the legal equation. It means it's harder for someone to enforce a legal ruling, but if you're in trouble for putting something online, you'll be in trouble for putting something online. Yeah. Oh, there's someone there? Or you can just shout.
There we go, got it. So when you were talking about centralization and decentralization, is it a bit of a false fallacy that just because something is decentralized that there is less legal risk, to your previous point as well?
There is less legal risk if something is decentralized. That is true. It's not no legal risk. You know, in the previous talk, it looks like to me that several prediction markets are basing their legal strategy on, well, we're decentralized, there's no legal risk. That's not true. There is still legal risk, but there's less legal risk, and also less in terms of obligations. It's easier to argue that you don't have to do things like AML or KYC if you're more decentralized. But it's also just harder to run your project if you have a time lock and you need a vote of a DAO and so on. But there's no such thing as no legal risk. And it's a question of what risk tolerance you want. Okay. No one else?
No further questions?
No. Okay. Thank you.